I lived in the Rico Depot. I have great memories of being a kid in the Rico Depot and my childhood there, and I was spoiled rotten because I got to do all kinds of things, including switch rails at Harp Switch Arm, just north of Rico's Depot, and the water tank, and also things that are involved in several engines, or if it's the mining industry with stories about gold. All of the mines and the way that all of these ores were removed from these wonderful hills, but mainly the railroad, whether it was Rio Grande Southern, Denver, and Rio Grande Western. We're going to cover two mountain ranges, the San Juan Mountains, and we're going to cover the Rico Mountain Range. We're going to cover K28s, K27s, and C17s. They're all pertinent to this story that we're going to hear. I wrote a book. It's just simply memories of being a kid living in the Rico Depot. And in the back of this book, my late husband, Roy Smith, his maternal and paternal great-great-grandparents were pioneers in Rico in the 1800s. A cousin has the originals. She allowed me to reprint the love letters starting 1878. After my book came out, my phone rang several years later, and it was a gentleman representing the International Rio Grande Southern Convention. I didn't know that the Rio Grande Southern Railroad has a convention once every year, different city every year, and this year was coming to Albuquerque. And he said people had read my book. He asked me to be the keynote speaker, which I was thrilled to do. It is an international convention. Japanese, Europeans, Americans. It was so exciting. And I was asked several different times for my address. One of the things I didn't ever expect was after a time period, they started arriving in the mail, the little bubble-wrapped mailers from the post office. Inside, it still tickles me today. Messages were basically the same. You can use anything you want. And inside were thumb drives. Thanks to the generosity of others, we now have a slideshow because at the convention, I only stood up there and talked. I didn't have anything to show. I need to introduce some people because now I'm going to start quoting them. So there is Glenn Bear, who's known me all my life. I think Glenn and I are really lucky kids. We both got to play in the rail yard there at Rico. There is in Durango one of the greatest Colorado railroad historians that I think I've ever known. His name is Al Scione. Born in Chicago, his dad was a surgeon. The minute summer hit, the whole family loaded up and went to Ridgeway. They love the San Juan Mountains. By the age of 11, Al knows two things that he loves: trains and photography. In his collection, 220,000 slides. Of that collection, 18,000 are on the Rio Grande Southern alone. He now is in the process of donating his entire slide collection to the University of Wyoming. Amos Cordova. Well, people in Durango may know of him, but I want to start with his career. Denver and Rio Grande Western, station manager. He was stationed 7 years in Chama. That company thought so highly of him, they then transferred him for the following 30 years in Durango, same company, same position. Then there's Betty Pellet. She was 5'0", but she was the color representative out of Dove Creek. To give you an idea of her personality, in the 1960s, she was invited to the Johnny Carson show. And as her segment was ending, Mr. Carson looked directly at the camera and said, "If there's such a thing as reincarnation, I want to come back as that pellet woman. Once a year, we would go on a Jeep trip. This time, we've come up the canyon of Silverton. We're going to go over the Uncompahgre. We're going to spend the night in Lake City. We stopped for lunch. I got up and I took this picture because of one word: isolation. That's exactly what it was like to live in Rico at the time. There was a scratch in the ground for the road out of town, and that was it. There were no phones in any home. There was no radio in any home. Cortez is 32 miles away. We could not get a signal from Cortez into Rico. Here's what's in the trunk of my family car. There's a blanket per person, food and water for 2 days for everybody. There's a come along, a shovel, and galoshes. We're all loaded up. Dad starts out of town, and we stop. It's the first one. Mom opens the door, gets out, she folds the seat forward, and us 3 girls climb out. All 4 of us go to the trunk, put our galoshes on. We're all going to walk the borrow ditch, and my dad is driving white-knuckled through the first one. I call it simply a bog. We have 4 more to go. It took hours leaving Rico to get to Dolores. The Rio Grande Southern connected Rico to the outside world. If you came down that road, you had to be really, really careful to be on. If you're by the river, you kind of crowded towards the center line, what would be there. And my dad came around the corner. We're headed to Rico, and the car's coming from Rico, and he hit the borrow ditch, and Dad almost had the wheels off of the edge. Not quite, but almost, because that's how narrow the road was. And in winter, it was horrible. Well, we didn't leave town often, and here's another story that'll tell you how often. Glenn's family, once a month, they would roll their family car out of the garage and put water in the radiator. They'd leave town. They'd come back to town, unload everything, drain the radiator. Those boys would roll the car into the garage. They left town once a month. People just did not leave town. This is how my mother shopped. I can vividly remember this. We're upstairs. Mother has brown, heavy paper. Not a grocery sack paper. It was thicker than that. And she put our feet on the paper, and she had a pencil, and she traced our feet. And the engineer came in, and it's a southbound train coming from Ridgeway going to Durango. And my mother asked if would that gentleman please walk these drawings of her 3 girls to Graydon's. Ruth Wagner shopped and bought every clothes I ever wore in Rico, because he'd take it there and then he'd come back and pick up whatever the shoes were or whatever, and they'd bring all the stuff back into Rico. My mom saw a pattern downstairs in Graydon's, and that's where the cloth was, and dishes and pretty household things. Upstairs was clothes. And she saw a china pattern, and she really liked it. And so she wrote a note, and he took the note to Ruth, and Mom and Dad owned a business in Cortez, a business in Durango, and so we had charge accounts. I didn't know people had money until I left Rico. I'm 57. I'm in 4th grade. I didn't know people needed money. We had charge accounts. So here comes on the Galloping Goose, my mother's entire china, and not a dish was cracked or chipped. You'd go to the Mercantile in Rico and you'd charge everything. Well, we shopped at Waldrug, which is now a restaurant, or Graydon's, which is now Brown's Shoe Store. And we're just going to charge anything we wanted, you know. I didn't know people needed money. That was simple. The lady's expecting, the baby's coming, but it's way too soon. There is not a locomotive at the depot. They literally cannot get that woman out of town. Her name's Aunt Allie. Anybody of any age, that's how she was addressed. She's an RN. She took care of everybody in Rico. She delivers this baby. It's a little girl. There is discussion. It looks like this baby is going to live. 3 pounds, 2 ounces. No doctor, no hospital, no incubator. All the kitchen stoves were coal. Overhead were warming ovens. That became this little girl's warming oven incubator. The baby that lived is my older sister Phyllis. Aunt Allie is Glenn Bear's mom, Allie Bear. I love this picture. It's really busy. Yes, that's real live fire between the two locomotives. What happened, locomotive on the left, the night watchman fell asleep. He let the fire in the firebox go out. They have to pull the locomotive on the right. The fireman is transferring real live fire to put in that firebox. It takes hours from a cold locomotive to get it back up to steam. There in the background is the Rico Depot. We lived upstairs. And you can't really see them in this picture, but my mom and dad are in there, just in line with the back fence post. And that's my mom's hire date. And then I come along. And I like this picture now because you can really see mom and dad. I grew up with the nickname Mud Hens. Didn't know where it came from. So Al Scione, he's the person that I really say is Colorado's railroad historian. Last summer I called Al and asked him, and he's teasing me. Didn't I ever run between the line and watch a 27 going down that line? And I said, no, but didn't do that one. He said, well, they waddled. And that is where the nickname came from. Now, 28s and bigger, they don't waddle, so there are no nicknames related to any other engine but a 27. So these are the 3 rails on the west side of the Rico Depot. The bay window was my playroom. On the ground floor is the black box, and the only window on this side of the depot, or any downstairs window opened, was this one. It's because that's where the telegraph key was. So whether it was a K-27 or if it was a goose that came in, they were usually left in the conveyances, and they would take the black box from the depot, climb the telegraph pole. No conveyance ever left a depot without checking dispatch to make sure the line was clear. I got to play in that building like it was my toy. I'm sitting at the ticket counter. I've got my paper dolls. I'm the station agent. The door on the east is open. All of a sudden I look up and gravel is flying through the air. A car is sliding in that gravel, and in runs the superintendent of the Argentine. He's got a gunny sack. I know what's in it. I call Mom. She comes down from upstairs. She goes to that window that I showed you. She reaches under the floorboards, heading with her face towards the north. It's the safe. It was completely hidden. People didn't even know we had a safe in that building. He gives her the gunny sack. She closes the lid. She goes upstairs. He leaves. Here's what's going on. What's in that gunny sack is concentrate from the shipment that is at the smelter. The smelter always had to call the mines to tell them what they intended to pay for that shipment. Well, there's a fight between both parties. A special's going to come, pick that gunny sack up. It's headed to Durango. One man's going to pick it up. He's called an umpire. He's going to retitrate all the ore that's in that gunny sack. He knows the freight weight, and he will tell both parties the dollar amount. He's the last word. That's it. There's my mom in the green dress. You can see how trucks could pull in between the platform and a goose. You can see the horn and the driver. And simply a great big plank connected both the platform and the freight car, and they could load directly into the bed of a truck. This is my dad, underground, Rico, Argentine, St. Louis tunnel. Time magazine sent to the Argentine a reporter and a photographer. That's who took this picture. They were published, and it was basically the Argentines' contribution in the war effort during World War II. Now, my mom had a husband with really dirty clothes. She had coal smoke to contend with. And on laundry day, my favorite day there in the whole world, I'm going to sit at that little chair and table, and I'm not going anywhere. So the fabric that we have now, you throw it in a dryer and it's done. Or you can hang it up and it's done. My mother had, and the housewives, this is everybody included, that you used a Maytag washer. You had no hot, you only had cold. Then the fabric was so darn thick and stiff, it took 2 days to iron the clothes. In the area that you saw all those posts, well, she had an area that she could build fire. And she actually made her own lye soap in that yard. Then she knew how to get it and make it and all that good stuff. That was the only soap of the day that she could get those miners' clothes clean. And of course, 3 girls were always out rolling around in all of that. She had to haul all the clothes down from the upstairs down to the freight room. So then you have a frost-proof water hydrant just like you have in your yard, but she had to hook a hose up and fill the Maytag with water. Then she had to drag that hose around to 2 rinse tubs. Well, you only could use the rinse tubs once, and then you had to empty all that water. There's one drain in this entire complex. It's the upstairs kitchen sink. We didn't even have a hot water heater. So what Mom has to do is drag the hose across the freight room, across the platform, put the end in between the rails, and then siphon all that water out. And then she had to fill the rinse tubs again. So she had to drag those hoses out of that freight room and siphon the water and make sure that she had the hose between the rails. That's big. That's a big thing, because when that locomotive came, that water had to be in certain places because of the firebox. They emptied all that ash to get that evaporated off. It could never set. No matter what year or what day, they had to get that water out of there. Then she has to roll the hose up. When that happens, pretty soon, here it comes. It's a K-27. It's just dancing along. I run to the end of the platform. The engineer, he gets out of the locomotive. He picks me up, puts me on the other seat, backs back into the rail yard, but I have total access to that whistle. I loved making those trains sing. These are the 2 men that absolutely spoiled me rotten. Mr. Cronenberg was the engineer. Mr. Quest was the fireman. To give you an example of how Glenn got to play in locomotives, by the age of 16, he is allowed to drive locomotives in the rail yard, never out, but in the rail yard there at Rico. I think we're 2 really lucky kids. Engine number 20, our movie star Ticket to Tommy Hawk. This smokestack is in Durango at the museum. Engine number 20, last train out of Rico, November 1951. Al and his family are on this train. It leaves Rico late, and what happens is it gets into Dolores after dark. Everybody gets off the train, they go find food, they have dinner, they spend the night, they have breakfast, they go to the rail yard in Dolores thinking they're going to ride it into Durango. That didn't happen. And inspector was in that rail yard. He found a cracked firebox. It's called coupling on and deadheading engine in. Locomotive came, coupled on, pulled that without being under its own power, and Al stood and watched as 20 is backed into the roundhouse in Durango. Thank goodness there are people out there that know what matters. Rocky Mountain Railroad Club purchased number 20. It sat for decades and decades in front of a motel there in Alamosa. And this is why it was the last train out of Rico. It's called the Blizzard 5152. I am so sorry. This is the only picture I've ever found with it showing the depot in the background. To get out of this building, the snow was clear up to our window sills. Either Mom or Dad would raise the window, take the broom, knock snow away so that we could get out, not knocking snow back into the living quarters. This is an indication of isolation, of true isolation now. My sisters and I are jumping on the bed. I get thrown into the chest of drawers and I'm really hurt. Nothing but my Mom and Dad have to get me to Dolores. Dad climbs out the window, runs up the depot hill, runs in the middle of the block where the burly billing sits. In the lobby was the payphone. He calls the mill. We're in luck. Empty truck is being loaded with concentrate. The driver's going to pick Mom and I up at 10 p.m. He's right on time. He takes us to Dolores to Dr. Merritt's. Clock on the wall, it's 2 a.m. It took 4 hours to go 22 miles. Now, Mom and I can't get home. What we have to do is spend a couple of nights at the Dolores Hotel. Empty truck, that driver picked us up, but they're not empty. All groceries, all mail, all light freight came back into Rico by those truckers. Rico would have starved out had it not been for those truckers. This is an example of keeping that line open on the RGS and how it connected Rico to the outside world. Well, my girlfriend Joyce Linton, she came up with the idea and she said, I want to go to the head of Stoner. And I knew about the head of Stoner because Joyce's older sisters and my older sisters, they were taken there. But she and I are enough younger, we didn't get to go at the same times. So I asked Mom and Dad if I could go head of Stoner. My dad said, yes, if you can get an older person to take you. So I ran across the street. His name's Donald Swank. Now, I am in the 2nd grade, and he's in the 3rd grade, and I came home and said, Donald will take us. And my dad said, okay. So we went on a 20-mile round trip horseback ride. 2 kids that were 2nd graders and 1 kid that was a 3rd grader by ourselves. And Donald really was one of those smart kids that you could call him a mountain man. From the minute that he hit the ground running, he had the common sense that he really knew what to do. And when we got up there, we were fighting what is a summer storm, and it came in from the south and it blew in it came in behind us. And all of a sudden, we absolutely jumped off those horses. We didn't put them under a tree. And we got on the ground. And I know where it says the hair on my arm stood straight up. Our hair and our arms, the hair was straight up because we were in an electrical storm. And we covered our heads and we laid there on the ground. We knew not to be on the horses because of the metal shoes. We knew not to be under a tree because that will attract lightning. And we're out there and we're just on open ground in an electrical storm. And it passed and we got on the horses and came back home. Otto Mears. I get stuck on him because he's such an interesting person. Born in Russia, by the age of 3, he is an orphan. I've never found out what happened. But he's handed off to a family of relatives back and forth until he reaches the age of 11. Someone comes up with this idea. We are going to put you on a ship by yourself. We are going to send you to San Francisco. You go out there, you find your uncle, you go live with him. Well, that happened, but all indications I've ever read, he never found that uncle. He's 21 years old. The Civil War breaks out. It's 1861. He joins the California Volunteer Militia. He's in the infantry. 1862, March 26, 28. He's in the New Mexico Territory. A real important battle over there. It's the Battle of Glorieta Pass. That's where those Union soldiers repel the Confederates of breaking through to the gold fields in California. After that battle, he's stationed Fort Craig south of Socorro. 1863-64, he's under the command of Kit Carson. After the war, he goes to Santa Fe. I've found that several places, never says how long. What he does next involves Colorado. I like to say he went over the hill. He landed in Siwatch. I've never found where he got his money. That intrigues me. He buys large tracts of land. He has a grist mill, a hardware store, huge mule pack trains. He had to have that to get his much-needed flour and his tools into the boomtown of Leadville. On one of these pack trips, he bumps into former Colorado Territorial Governor, Mr. Gilpin. Gilpin and Mears really hit it off. He went to the Colorado legislature and petitioned for not one charter for a toll road, he got 2 charters. He built toll roads over Marshall Pass, Poncho Pass, thinking if I keep this under 4% grade, maybe a railroad will come along and buy that. How he knew the importance of the grade was this. As a really young kid, he started working for railroads in California. He knew how, in all of that apprenticeship, how to build the roads for the beds of the railroad tracks. He learned how to set ties, how to lay the rails, and he learned the importance of the grade. All of those toll roads that he built were less than 5% grade. Now, that happened. The railroad did come along, Denver and Rio Grande rail lines. They bought those 2 toll roads. He's got money now. But I think he was a good businessman. He kept his operation in Siwatch going. But now, Gilpin introduces him to high society in Denver. There's something in Denver he really didn't like, so he's going to take care of it. The Capitol building, the construction project had drug on for a long time. He did not like anything about the exterior appearance. Mears goes around, convinces the Colorado Mining Association to donate 200 ounces of gold. They did. Mears takes down the highly tarnished, ugly appearance of copper, and it's Mears that puts the gold on the dome for the first time. After this, he's above Silverton and Uray. He's got a rail line, and he also has a smelter at Durango, south of town. The Animus Museum has a great display on these 2 issues, but we're going to jump now to 1883 to 1885. Because he's in the Silverton area, it didn't take him very long. He gets another petition for another charter for a toll road. If you're in a wagon, his fee was $5. If you're on a horse by yourself, it's 5 cents. And I like this picture because he built the $1 Million Highway and there's still no guardrails. We're going to jump 1889. Otto Mears. He's left Ouray. He's headed towards Montrose. What he's looking for is a really large, flat piece of ground. He finds it. He buys the land. He builds a roundhouse, a machine shop, a depot. He names the location Ridgeway. 1890, his railroad, the Rio Grande Southern, now is headed towards Rico. We have the Denver and Rio Grande Western on the right-hand side of this slide. So we're going to start Denver to Alamosa standard gauge. From Alamosa, we are going to go over Cumbres, past Chama, into Durango, and south of Durango down to Farmington, narrow gauge. I'm going to tell when the tracks came up on this side because in 1968, 69, and 70, the rails are removed. 1981, Mr. Bradshaw bought the remaining section of the Denver and Rio Grande Western, now known as the Durango-Silverton train. But if you look at the top of this slide, you see Denver and Rio Grande Western again. So we're going to go Denver, Grand Junction, to Montrose, to Ridgeway, and that line continues out of the frame of this picture to Salt Lake City, Utah. Ridgeway, I'm going to address it now as the RGS line, my line. We're going to go to Telluride and we're going to go to the end of the canyon. That's where the mill was. Then we're going to come around and there is a heavy mark at Ophir. We're going to talk about Ophir in a minute. Then we're going to come into Rico. We're coming into Durango to complete that line in 1892 into Durango. So the Denver and Rio Grande Western is 10 years older than the RGS line. This is why I wanted to point out Ophir. Getting the railroad from Ophir into Rico was an engineering project. It's called the Ophir Loop. There are pieces of ground that simply are missing. You can see the trestles on this side. If you look up towards the peaks in the background, that's the village of Ophir. We're going to be looking now back against the trestle that you just saw. And this is the other side of the loop. This is the east side. The depot is there in the foreground. But look at the flume. They built a flume all the way into the town of Ophir and dumped the water over the edge of the canyon. Talk about engineering. Talk about the skill set for the persons who built this structure. If you go around the corner and the backside, still in its location, is called the Silver Hat Mining District, and it's a little sign stuck in the ground. C-17s. These are the locomotives of the Rio Grande line. They're babies. You can tell that instantly. These are K-27s. They look familiar, but they're not. They are lighter and narrower than the K-28s that run out of Durango, Silverton, Chama, and Tonito. This is the only weight and size that the bridges and trestles on the RGS line could take. K-27s, 455, 461 were sold to the RGS line from the Denver and Rio Grande Western. Now you see three numbers, 282. That means 2 wheels around the curves, 8 drivers, and 2 wheels under the firebox. It took one K-27 to replace 3 C-17s. This tells a huge story. There's a long work car, short work car, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 C-17s pushing the rotary snowplow over a trestle. Meadow Creek exists just before the curve where you pop out up on top of Lizard Head. Crews leaving Lizard Head knew dark was going to overtake this train before they ever reached Rico. Those short and long boxes, that's where people are going to eat and have to spend the night until daylight comes the next morning. We're on Lizard Head now. We've topped out. Look at this picture and think about the mechanics in Rico. Their skill set, they had to have high skills to keep machinery operating on this line under adverse severe conditions. Think of the crews that ran these trains. Look at the men in addition to machinery that it took to keep this line operating year-round. We're going to talk about speed. If the cars were empty, they could run 25 miles per hour. Loaded with livestock, 18, 12, 10, 3. Think about Ridgeway to Durango. Well, if livestock, they got where they were going before they got to an unloading place with a stock pen, they were simply turned loose. The federal law was every 12 hours animals had to be fed and watered. So now we're going to be with Al. He and his dad are chasing a cattle shipment. They've left Durango. They're headed towards Antonito, but there's a derailment 5 cars before they get to the station. Those cows were all unloaded right where that train sat because of that federal law. The brand inspector followed every single shipment of livestock. Didn't matter where they originated from. They could levy hefty fines if there was any infraction after the 12-hour mark. Many in this area know the Galloping Goose. They're called rail buses. This is unique to Ridgeway. The machine shop and the mechanics there took a Pierced Arrow gasoline engine. They built the cab. That cab has seating for a few people and a driver, not an engineer. They also built the light freight car. I know this is a special because of the white flags. The hood's up, it's barely out of Ridgeway. So what's going to happen if he can't get this going? White flags have to go down, and whether it's a K-27, K-28, or a Goose, no conveyance ever left a depot without what's called a black box in the cab. This gentleman is going to have to take the black box out of this conveyance. He's going to have to go to the closest telegraph pole, climb the telegraph pole, clip that black box on, and get dispatch in Durango. That line is going to have to be shut down if he cannot get it started and going again. That's to avoid head-on collisions. 1935, Betty Pellet. She got the mail contract, Ridgeway to Durango, for this RGS line. That was a huge moneymaker and profit center for this railroad. There's Galloping Goose equipment that is running at Ridgeway. I don't know its schedule. Telluride has a fully restored Galloping Goose. I don't know its schedule. This Galloping Goose here at Dolores is busy. It runs on the Durango-Silverton line. It runs on Chama-Antonito line. It is really, really got a lot of people that love it. 2006, something wonderful happens for Colorado. The Colorado Railroad Museum in Golden is opened. I don't know where they came from, who had them, where they were stored. 3 galloping geese were donated to that museum. And then, engine number 20, same year, was donated to that museum in Golden. 14 years in the making, $1.5 million, all donated. Ribbon cutting ceremony last August. Every 3 days, every 30 minutes, excursions. Once again, number 20 is pulling people riding the rails behind it. I'm going to jump to 1953. Mom and Dad had a family member in Whittier, California. They got tickets for their family and our family to go to the Rose Parade. We're going to sit in the bleachers. My aunt liked to eat at Knoxberry Farm. They had a chicken dinner that was really great. We have dinner. We come out. My dad says, "Oh, Mavis, look." She looks and she starts running. Now, my mom was a lady. But this situation, she's got her hands over her head and she's running. I'd never seen her do either. Then my dad starts running, and then he stepped off. It's number 24. Us girls start running. That belonged to us, and he did too. The engineer and the locomotive were from the RGS line. He had followed it out to California, and he was going to run it until he could get other individuals trained on how to run it. Al last summer told me that same locomotive was here in Durango. It's getting an overhaul, in fact, a tune-up. I went to the museum. A really nice young man took me back there. 69 years after Knoxberry Farm, I got to see it once again. Glenn is that tremendous friend of mine. He gave me his family book. This is how it starts. His great-great-maternal, paternal grandparents, 1800s pioneers of Rico. 1892, there are 599 mines operating in the Rico Mountains around Rico. There are 14 hotels, the largest owned by the owner of the Enterprise mine. Its name, the Enterprise Hotel, takes 3 city lots in length. It's 4 stories high, 62 plush rooms. On the ground floor, there is a large sample display room, a reading room, a ballroom, a bar, and a plush formal dining hall. You had to dress for dinner. There are 7 female boarding houses. That's the red light district. And Royce's grandfather, Frank Royce, is born in Rico, December 1892. People had to get to work, and this is how they did it. If you go north of Silverton, go up the canyon, and you'll find Astoria Basin. It's great. Whoever put the pictures and the information center there, they really need gold stars by their name. Every single mine in that basin is labeled. But what's truly amazing, the towers are still standing, the cable is still suspended, and the buckets are still hanging. I was at Cortez at Glenn's house, and he said his dad, Alf, had worked using one of these to get to work. And I said, "Where?" He said, "The Black Hawk." Oh my gosh, I still get goosebumps every time I say the name of that mine. To get to that location at Rico, it is absolutely treacherous. So I really want to make a statement. The mule skinners that got the lumber for the first time into these areas, plus hauled all the equipment to the mines, they had a high skill set. When you look at where the mines are located, think of the engineering it took to put all of this together. Then, if you were a pioneer and you came to Colorado to be in these gold mines and gold fields, you may have arrived without a skill set, but by the time they finished constructing all of these, there was definitely a very high skill set. Again, different trip. I'm back at Glenn's, and he's telling me his dad worked at the Yellow Jacket mine. Well, Bob and Betty Pellet, they owned it. Betty Pellet was that representative. The Yellow Jacket mine, I never knew several things until last summer, and Glenn taught me a great deal. I'm going to tie it into the Enterprise mine, the strike of Rico. So as Glenn describes how the mines, both side by side, same situation, his dad Alf would go in and they would load around, they'd come out, they'd wire, they'd blast. These two mines, the only situation, whether in the Rico Mountains or the San Juan Mountains, the miners have to leave for hours on end, usually 2 to 3. Then they'd come back and literally sweep up and sweep high-grade silver into sacks. That's what these men are sitting on. Why are they not stolen? It's because ore has what's called a signature. If you steal a sack and you want to cash it, to get a dollar amount for what you're trying to cash in, you have to take it to an assayer. The minute he titrates that ore, he's going to see the signature. He'll see where that ore came from. Now these sacks are going to have a really long trip, but we need to cover the ores out of the Rico Mountains and the San Juan Mountains. Gold, silver, lead, zinc, and copper. Those are the 5 ores. Mule pack trains are going to start here at the Enterprise Mine, and they're going to take it to Main Street in Rico. All of that ore is transferred, covered wagons pulled by oxen. You're going to head south out of Rico. You're going to go a distance, not a great one, just a distance. There's a new freight road that's been cut. It's to the east, through the freight road, through the Hermosa, coming out basically like you get into Purgatory Ski Area. Head south to Durango, but a really short distance now. One more turn to the east, and they have arrived. It's the northern point of the Denver and Rio Grande Western Narrow Gauge Railroad, still in use today. It's Rockwood. The freight road still in use today is Scotch Creek. Once that's all loaded on the train, that shipment is going to go past Durango, past Chama, over Cumbres. It's going to end up in Alamosa. Everything has to get transferred again. This time, Denver Rio Grande Western standard gauge. I do not know where the ore left the United States. I know where it went. The United Kingdom of Great Britain, specific country of Wales, 1881. The reason that the acid plant was built at Rico is this. The Argentine was called upon, again by the United States of America, to help them fight a war. It's not the war like in Europe, it's called the Cold War. The Argentine sets on really large deposits of iron pyrite, which is known as fool's gold. Iron pyrite is a major component in the manufacturing of uranium. Iron pyrite is the component that they break down and create sulfuric acid out of. What you did was, when they went to the areas that actually processed it, we didn't there, is that you have vats of sulfuric acid, you put the uranium in, it leaches out, and what you have is what the pure cake. And the pure cake then is skimmed off, and that's how it's used. And that's how you produce the uranium. I mean, this nation really, really was known, and the Four Corners were known way back in the 1800s. I started the first grade in 1954. 1953 was when my dad came from underground. We just call it coming to the surface. He had great carpenter skills. The Argentine bought the Rico Hotel, the cafe on Main Street, and the movie theater, and the boiler union crew came from Chicago because they were highly skilled to build that acid plant. They stayed at the Rico Motel. Mom was asked to be the manager. And so we lived in what's now the restaurant there. And she managed the hotel. It came online in 54. And in 55, my dad came home from work and he says, "Oh my God, if it hadn't been for George, a valve had stuck." and George went back in that plant and he got it loose. Otherwise it would have blown. And everybody would never have escaped the fumes. We'd all would have had serious lung damage, just almost like being gassed in World War I. And George opened that valve and got it unstuck. But he was Rico's hero. And then by 55, it started to show. By 57, when we moved, all of the roofs in Rico were already rusted. And it killed all the wildlife in the Dolores River. It killed all of the trees on what's called Telescope Mountain. And it finally, everything ended, and nature takes care of healing its wounds, and you can't ever tell it was ever there. But it was really a major part of the Cold War. That's why they built it. Whether it's the Rico Mountains or the San Juan Mountains of southwest Colorado, people from around the world know of these trains, and they come here because of their love. We are truly lucky individuals because of our history here in southwest Colorado. There's a lot of stuff that is just simply gone, but it's still here if you look. We have great history.